The night that didn't ask for attention. That night did not arrive with noise. It didn't announce itself. It didn't demand to be remembered. It slipped in quietly like so many nights before it, while the city outside continued breathing on autopilot. Cars passed below his window. Lights blinked on and off in distant buildings. Somewhere, someone laughed. Somewhere else, someone argued. Life was happening loudly everywhere except where he was. He sat alone in his apartment, the kind of small, rented space that holds a person but never quite reflects them. The walls were bare, not because he didn't care, but because he never stayed anywhere long enough to decide what belonged to him. One lamp was on, just one. The rest of the room stayed in shadow, unfinished, like a thought that never reached its end. He almost picked up his phone. Almost. His hand moved without instruction, muscle memory guiding it. Thumb ready, screen ready, endless content waiting. That familiar reflex had saved him countless times from moments like this. Moments where silence grew heavy. Moments where thoughts started asking questions he didn't want to answer. Scrolling was easier. Scrolling required nothing. It blurred time, softened edges, made hours disappear without consequence. He had mastered that skill. Everyone had, but something stopped him. Not a sound, not a notification, not guilt, just a subtle resistance inside his chest. A pause that felt unfamiliar, as if the moment itself had leaned forward slightly and asked him to stay. He let the phone rest face down on the table. The screen went dark, but the room felt brighter somehow, as if attention itself had weight. He exhaled slowly. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. The clock on the wall read 11:52 p.m., not late enough to justify exhaustion, too late to pretend it was still part of the day. That strange hour where expectations fade, but thoughts sharpen. He had done everything required of him. He had worked. He had answered messages. He had smiled in the right places, laughed at the right moments, said, "I'm fine," without hesitation. From the outside, the day had been complete. From the inside, something felt unresolved. Not broken, not painful, just unfinished, like a sentence left without punctuation. He looked around the room. One chair, one table, a window that reflected more of him than the city beyond it. His own face stared back faintly in the glass, softened by darkness. He looked older than he felt, or maybe younger. It was hard to tell when time had started slipping past him without clear markers. Days blended, weeks folded into each other. Life moved forward, but rarely felt like it was moving with him. He noticed his hands resting in his lap, still, completely still. That alone felt strange. His hands were always doing something, typing, holding, reaching, swiping. He realized how rarely he allowed them to do nothing, how rarely he allowed himself to do nothing. Not rest. Rest implied recovery. This was something else. This was presence. A memory arrived without warning, quietly, like it had been waiting for permission. He saw himself younger, sitting on a bed that wasn't this one, in a room that smelled different, believing life would feel clearer by now, not easier, just clearer. He remembered how certain he had been that adulthood came with understanding, that one day things would click into place, that there would be a moment where everything made sense and stayed that way. He smiled faintly at the thought, not with bitterness, with something closer to recognition. He hadn't failed. That realization surprised him. He hadn't fallen behind. He hadn't missed a secret checkpoint everyone else had passed. The truth was quieter and harder to accept.
He had simply been living on autopilot, choosing convenience over attention, emotion over meaning. He had been present for his life without truly being there. Outside the window, a single light flickered on in a nearby building. Someone else awake, someone else sitting in their own quiet. That small detail grounded him. He wasn't alone in this moment, even if it felt that way. Across the city, countless people were suspended in similar pauses, unaware of each other but connected by the same restlessness. He breathed again, slower this time. His mind didn't rush forward. It didn't rehearse tomorrow. It didn't replay yesterday. It stayed right here. And for the first time in weeks, that felt enough. Nothing dramatic happened. No revelation, no decision carved in stone, no sudden urge to change his life overnight. Just a subtle internal shift. A promise he didn't speak out loud. To listen more. To pause longer. To stop escaping moments that were trying to teach him something quietly. When he finally stood and moved toward the bed, it wasn't because he was tired. It was because he felt complete enough to rest. The kind of rest that doesn't come from exhaustion, but from acceptance.
He lay down, lights off, darkness settling naturally around him. The city continued outside, indifferent. The night passed the way nights always do, but he didn't. He carried something with him into sleep, not answers, awareness. And awareness has a way of changing things slowly, invisibly, until one day you realize you're standing somewhere new. Some nights don't arrive loudly, they don't knock, they don't ask for attention. They simply appear, quiet and unnoticed, while the world scrolls past them. That night was like that. Ordinary, forgettable, easy to miss. He had been seconds away from losing it like all the others, from letting it dissolve into digital noise, from waking up the next morning unchanged. But he stayed. And staying, he would later realize, was the beginning of everything. When the quiet started following him, he woke up before the alarm. Not suddenly, not startled, just awake. The room looked the same. The light through the curtains hadn't changed. The city outside was already moving, already late for something. Nothing on the surface suggested this morning was different. And yet something felt slightly misaligned, as if the world had shifted a few degrees overnight. He lay still for a moment, listening, not for sound, but for that same quiet presence from the night before. It was still there. Softer now, but unmistakable. He reached for his phone, then paused. The pause came easier this time. He noticed that. He let the screen stay dark a few seconds longer than usual. In that gap, a thought surfaced. Not loud, not urgent, just honest. I don't want to rush today. It surprised him how foreign that felt. Wanting less speed in a world designed for more. When he finally stood, the routine unfolded automatically. Shower, coffee, clothes chosen without thought. He watched himself move through it all, aware of how much of his life happened without him truly participating. Yet today, that awareness didn't feel accusatory. It felt observational, like watching weather pass instead of fighting it. Outside, the air was cool, the kind of morning that promises nothing special. People walked with purpose, eyes forward, shoulders tight. Everyone carried invisible timelines, invisible pressure. He blended into the flow easily. He always had. Being invisible was one of his quiet skills. But as he walked, he noticed small things he usually ignored. The rhythm of his steps, the sound of coffee cups clinking behind a cafe window, the way sunlight caught dust in the air. None of it was meaningful on its own. Together, it felt grounding, like proof that life existed outside his screen. At work, the hours moved predictably. Messages arrived, tasks stacked themselves neatly, conversations repeated familiar patterns. He answered when spoken to, he smiled when expected. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, something was shifting again. He caught himself before opening a tab he didn't need. He noticed how often he reached for distraction the moment boredom appeared. It wasn't judgment, it was curiosity. Why now? He wondered. What am I avoiding? The answer didn't come immediately. Answers rarely do. They circle first. They wait for space. By afternoon, fatigue crept in. Not physical, mental, the kind that comes from constant alertness, from always being available. He realized how rarely he allowed his mind to be unoccupied. Silence had always felt like wasted time. Now it felt like something he'd been starving. On his way home, the city looked different again. Not prettier, not uglier, just more real. He noticed faces, not stories, just faces, each one carrying its own version of unfinished thoughts. He wondered how many of them were also moving on autopilot, waiting for a quiet night to interrupt them. Back in his apartment, the familiar stillness returned. The same lamp, the same chair, the same window. He set his keys down slowly, deliberately. The silence greeted him without tension this time. It didn't demand to be filled. He didn't turn on music. He didn't open a video. He sat, and sat longer than felt comfortable. That was when it surfaced, not a memory, a realization. He had been living as if life were something to get through rather than something to be in. Each day, a task to complete. Each night, a gap to erase. He wasn't unhappy. That was the dangerous part. He was comfortable. Comfortable enough to stop asking questions. Comfortable enough to let years slide past without friction. The thought tightened his chest slightly. Not fear, recognition. He saw how easily another decade could pass this way. How easily he could wake up older, still telling himself he'd start paying attention. Soon. He stood and walked to the window. Night was settling again. The city lights flickered on, one by one, like signals no one was meant to answer. Somewhere across the street, a man leaned against a balcony railing, staring into space. Somewhere below, laughter echoed briefly before fading. Life continued, indifferent, relentless. He pressed his hand against the glass, not dramatically, just enough to feel something solid. I don't want to miss this, he thought. Not the city, not the night, this feeling, this awareness, this fragile moment of clarity that could disappear if neglected. Again, nothing dramatic followed. No vows, no plans, no declarations of change, just a decision so small it barely qualified as one. To notice when he was escaping, to stay when staying felt uncomfortable, to allow quiet to finish its sentences. He sat back down. The phone remained untouched. Time stretched without resistance. He felt restless, then calm, then restless again. He realized presence wasn't a permanent state. It required returning to it, over and over. Later, lying in bed, he understood something new. That night before hadn't been a single moment. It had been an opening. And openings don't close politely. They follow you. They ask to be acknowledged. They reshape how you see even the most ordinary hours. Sleep came slowly, not because his mind raced, but because it wandered gently. When it finally took him, it carried him deeper than usual, into a rest that felt earned, not stolen, and somewhere between waking and dreaming, a quiet truth settled in. This wasn't about changing his life. It was about finally arriving in it. But awareness, once awakened, doesn't stay quiet forever. And tomorrow, it would ask more of him. The next few days passed without ceremony. No signs, no confirmation, just life continuing as it always had. And yet, he felt different moving through it, as if something behind his eyes had been switched on and couldn't be turned off again. He noticed the impatience in his own breath when waiting for an elevator. He noticed how quickly his attention fractured the moment silence appeared. Most of all, he noticed how uncomfortable stillness became once he stopped running from it. Awareness, he learned, wasn't peaceful. It was honest. At work, a conversation unfolded that he'd had dozens of times before. Same words, same tone, same polite laughter. But this time, halfway through responding, he caught himself drifting. Not bored, detached. He heard his own voice speaking automatically while his mind stood several steps back, watching. That separation unsettled him. He realized how often he showed up physically while leaving mentally. How many moments of his life had been attended by a version of himself that wasn't fully there. That evening, he arrived home earlier than usual. The apartment greeted him with its familiar quiet, but something felt heavier this time. Not oppressive, expectant. He sat without turning on the lamp. The light from the window was enough. Shadows stretched across the room in ways he hadn't noticed before. The chair looked older. The walls seemed closer. He felt exposed, as if the silence had learned his name. He reached for his phone instinctively, then stopped. The urge was stronger tonight, sharper. He understood now that distraction wasn't casual. It was protective. A shield against something that wanted to surface. He placed the phone face down and waited. His chest tightened. His thoughts grew louder. This was the part he usually avoided. Memories didn't arrive all at once. They never do. They slipped in quietly, pretending to be harmless. A moment from years ago. Another from recently. Times when he had said later instead of now. When he'd chosen ease over honesty. When he'd stayed silent because it was simpler than being seen. None of these moments were dramatic on their own. Together, they formed a pattern he couldn't ignore anymore. He realized then that his life hadn't been shaped by big decisions. It had been shaped by small avoidances, tiny retreats, micro escapes repeated so often they became invisible. The nights he scrolled instead of feeling, the mornings he rushed instead of noticing, the relationships he maintained at a safe distance, comfortable, predictable, quiet in the wrong way. His breathing slowed as the weight of that recognition settled in. This wasn't regret. It was clarity. Regret looks backward. Clarity looks around. And what he saw unsettled him more than any mistake could. He had built a life where nothing hurt deeply because nothing touched deeply either. A sound from outside broke the stillness. A door closing, footsteps fading. Somewhere, someone was moving forward without thinking about it. He wondered how many people reached moments like this and turned away. How many sensed the edge of something important and chose comfort instead. He understood why. Standing here felt unstable, like stepping onto thin ice without knowing if it would hold. He stood and paced the room slowly. Each step felt deliberate, as if the floor demanded acknowledgement. He stopped by the window again. His reflection stared back at him, layered over the city lights. For a moment, he didn't recognize the man looking back. Not because he had changed, but because he had finally looked closely. The lines around his eyes told stories he'd never listened to. Fatigue, restraint, quiet longing. I've been here before, he thought. Not in this room, in this feeling, Brief moments over the years when life had nudged him awake. Moments he'd dismissed as tiredness, as stress, as something that would pass, and it always had, because he let it. This time felt different, not louder, deeper, like a question that wouldn't accept distraction as an answer. He sat again, hands resting on his knees, grounding himself. The silence stretched. He resisted the urge to fill it. Minutes passed, maybe more. Time lost its urgency. In that space, another truth emerged, softer but heavier. He didn't actually know what he wanted. He had spent so long reacting that desire itself had become unfamiliar. Wanting felt risky. Wanting meant choosing. Choosing meant responsibility. His throat tightened, not from sadness, from proximity. He was close to something he'd been circling his entire adult life. The realization that presence wasn't about slowing down or unplugging. It was about taking ownership of each moment instead of outsourcing it to distraction. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and let his head drop slightly. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel unproductive without guilt, to exist without justification. The world didn't collapse. Nothing demanded explanation. The quiet held him without asking for anything in return. When he finally picked up his phone, it wasn't to escape. He opened the Notes app instead. The blank screen stared back at him, waiting. He hesitated, then typed a single sentence. Not a plan, not a goal, just a truth. I want to stop missing my own life. He read it twice. It didn't solve anything, but it anchored something. He set the phone down again and exhaled. The tension hadn't vanished, but it had shifted. It felt like standing at the edge of a long road you don't yet understand. Daunting, but real. That night, sleep came unevenly. His mind replayed moments, reframed memories, connected dots he'd never aligned before. Awareness was no longer a visitor. It was becoming a resident, and residents eventually rearranged the furniture. As dawn approached, one final thought surfaced, clear and uninvited. If he didn't honor this moment, it would harden into something heavier later. Regret doesn't arrive suddenly. It accumulates quietly, built from ignored awakenings. He fell asleep knowing this wasn't the end of something. It was the middle, and middles are dangerous. They ask for courage without offering certainty. Tomorrow would test him, not with a crisis, but with choice. And that choice would reveal whether this quiet awakening was temporary or transformative. Morning arrived without announcement. No dramatic light through the window, no sense of renewal, just the same pale sky and the same room, unchanged. And yet, he woke with the unmistakable feeling that something had shifted overnight, not resolved, not healed, but acknowledged. That alone altered the weight of the day. He moved slowly, noticing how each small action carried more presence than before. The sound of water in the sink, the texture of the floor beneath his feet. Even the silence felt different now, less empty, more observant. He realized the world hadn't changed at all. He had simply stopped rushing past it. Outside, the city moved as it always did. People walked with purpose, eyes fixed ahead, minds elsewhere. He was one of them, but today he felt slightly out of sync, like someone who had stepped off a fast-moving walkway and now had to adjust to standing still, while everything else sped by. It was uncomfortable, but it was honest. Throughout the day, small moments tested him. A pause in conversation, where he would usually fill the space. A notification he chose not to open immediately. A familiar impulse to multitask that he noticed and gently resisted.
None of these choices were heroic, but together they formed something new, a pattern of attention, a quiet form of integrity. In the afternoon, he sat alone for a moment longer than necessary before returning to work. His thoughts drifted, not aimlessly, but inward. He understood now that the hardest part wasn't waking up, it was staying awake. Awareness demanded effort. It asked to be renewed again and again, especially when life tried to pull him back into automatic motion. That evening, he returned home under a sky slowly losing its color. The apartment welcomed him again with its familiar stillness, but this time, it didn't feel heavy. It felt neutral, a space waiting to be inhabited consciously. He turned on the lamp and sat in the chair by the window, the same one from that first night. The moment mirrored itself, but he didn't. He thought about how easily this could have been missed, how close he'd been to scrolling past the most important conversation he'd had in years, the one with himself.
Morning arrived without announcement. No dramatic light through the window, no sense of renewal. Just the same pale sky and the same room, unchanged. And yet, he woke with the unmistakable feeling that something had shifted overnight. Not resolved, not healed, but acknowledged. That alone altered the weight of the day. He moved slowly, noticing how each small action carried more presence than before. The sound of water in the sink, the texture of the floor beneath his feet. Even the silence felt different now, less empty, more observant. He realized the world hadn't changed at all. He had simply stopped rushing past it. Outside, the city moved as it always did. People walked with purpose, eyes fixed ahead, minds elsewhere. He was one of them, but today he felt slightly out of sync, like someone who had stepped off a fast-moving walkway and now had to adjust to standing still while everything else sped by. It was uncomfortable, but it was honest. Throughout the day, small moments tested him. A pause in conversation where he would usually fill the space. A notification he chose not to open immediately. A familiar impulse to multitask that he noticed and gently resisted. None of these choices were heroic, but together they formed something new. A pattern of attention, a quiet form of integrity. In the afternoon, he sat alone for a moment longer than necessary before returning to work. His thoughts drifted, not aimlessly, but inward. He understood now that the hardest part wasn't waking up. It was staying awake. Awareness demanded effort. It asked to be renewed again and again, especially when life tried to pull him back into automatic motion. That evening, he returned home under a sky slowly losing its color. The apartment welcomed him again with its familiar stillness. But this time, it didn't feel heavy. It felt neutral, a space waiting to be inhabited consciously. He turned on the lamp and sat in the chair by the window, the same one from that first night. The moment mirrored itself, but he didn't. He thought about how easily this could have been missed, how close he'd been to scrolling past the most important conversation he'd had in years, the one with himself. He understood now that life didn't shout its turning points, it whispered them, and most people were too distracted to hear. A sense of responsibility settled over him, gentle but firm. Not responsibility to change everything overnight, not to reinvent his life or make bold declarations, but responsibility to show up, to notice, to choose presence when avoidance felt easier, to sit with discomfort long enough to learn from it. He reflected on the years ahead, not with fear, with realism. He knew he would forget sometimes. He would fall back into old habits. He would scroll when tired, rush when anxious, distract himself when feeling exposed. But he also knew something crucial now. He would notice when it happened, and noticing changed everything. He stood and walked to the window one last time that night. The city lights blinked softly, indifferent and beautiful. Somewhere out there, thousands of people were moving through their own quiet moments, unaware of their significance. He felt connected to them in a way he never had before, not through noise, through shared silence. He sat again and closed his eyes briefly. No meditation, no technique, just a breath, then another. He felt grounded in his body, anchored in the present, aware of the simplicity of being alive in this exact moment. Nothing needed fixing. Nothing needed escaping. When he finally reached for his phone, it wasn't to numb himself. It was to set a single reminder, not an alarm, just a line of text scheduled for another quiet evening in the future. Pause, you're here. He smiled faintly. It wasn't profound, but it was enough. That night, sleep came gently, not because his mind was empty, but because it was settled. He didn't feel complete in the sense of having answers. He felt complete in the sense of being honest with where he was. And somewhere between waking and dreaming, he understood something that stayed with him. Life wasn't asking him to be louder, faster, or better. It was asking him to be present again and again, even on ordinary nights, especially on ordinary nights. Some moments don't change your life by force. They change it by invitation. Quiet, patient, easy to ignore, impossible to forget once accepted. And this time, he didn't miss it. If this story stayed with you, maybe this quiet evening mattered too. Thank you for spending these moments with Quiet Evenings. If you enjoy stories that don't shout, but stay, consider subscribing. More quiet nights are waiting.